10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 378. Hey, everybody, welcome back to episode 378 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. New month, but we are sticking to the same series. We're going to keep talking about the diminished scale, diminished chords, places to use them, and get this really, really important sound, this really popular sound in the jazz language into your playing. Want to make sure you understand the theory behind it. And that's something we're going to talk about today. We're going to start to get into the theory of chords over diminished and how to derive chords from a diminished scale and lots of fun stuff this week. But before we jump into the show, just want to remind you this is a listener-supported podcast, which means we don't take any advertisements on the show. Instead, we just rely on people like you that are getting benefit out of this to keep the podcast going with a small monthly donation. And for that donation, you do get a PDF and audio examples of every single episode. We use the Patreon platform to support us, and you can find us and all the details on becoming a member of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson family by going to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners, or you can simply go to patreon.com and search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. Each one of those works, and you get instant access to every single episode that we have ever done. Quick shout out to some new $5 patrons this week. Thank you to Rudolph, Rob, Jean-Claude, Janina, and Amelia. Thank you for becoming a part of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson family, and to the over 350 supporters we have over there. Thank you. We could not do this without you. So 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or patreon.com, search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. All right. So we left off our last episode about diminished, talking about playing modes between the whole half diminished and the half whole diminished. And in this episode, the third installment in the series on diminished, I want to talk about some chord theory and how we can sort of split the scale up into some chords and some interesting observations of what chords come from the diminished scale. And then I'm going to give you kind of a cool exercise that you can use to put this new information, or this information that we're talking about in this episode, into action and actually get it on your instrument and sort of test yourself on the knowledge that I'm about to give you in this episode. Okay, so feel free to pull out your PDF from this week's episode, and let's look at what I have written on the top of it. So it looks a little bit funky because I have some things color-coded, but it will all make sense after I explain it to you. So let's go back to our old friend, the C whole half diminished scale. Now, that's what we learned about in the very, very first episode of this series. We talked about the whole half diminished scale and how that goes over a fully diminished seventh chord. And that was sort of our first thing that we wanted to understand about our diminished scale and chord theory. Okay, so now what you'll notice is that I have half of the notes in that scale highlighted in red and half of the notes in that scale highlighted in blue. And what I want to understand is that we can actually pull two chords out of this scale. And we're actually going to see that this scale is formed by just putting two fully diminished seventh chords together into a scale. So one of the things about the diminished scale is that it's not a 7-note scale. You know, all of our major and minor scales, they're all 7-note scales. But this one is an 8-note scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then you're back on the root. So this is a little bit interesting in that way. We're so used to 7-note scales because usually we learn like our major scales and our minor scales first. So there's something that interesting that happens when it's an 8-note scale is that we can get two 4-note chords out of that scale. So obviously, if we go to the root and we play every other note, we're going to get, in this case, a C fully diminished seventh chord shape, or arpeggio, chord, whatever you want to call it. But the interesting thing is if we play all of those in between notes, so all of the notes in the diminished scale that we didn't just play, what we actually get is another diminished seventh chord arpeggio shape, whatever you want to call it, that's up a whole step from the original. So actually, this scale, this whole half diminished scale, can be broken down into two diminished seventh chords. And that is a really, really interesting thing to notice. That can be very useful to us in a lot of situations when we're improvising or writing or whatever we're doing. And a lot of us will just think about the diminished scale as like, okay, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. And we'll start tracing that diminished scale by just using the interval. But I think it's also really important to realize another way to form the diminished scale is to think, like in this case, it's a C diminished chord and a D diminished chord stacked on top of each other, basically. And we're just playing the resulting notes from that collection, that 8-note collection. Okay. So, what I want you to do this week is I want you to practice all of your diminished scales, but I want you to split them up into these two chords. So, if you look down below on your PDF, what I have is I have all 12 diminished seventh chords split up into their two arpeggio form. So, you see the first one is C, diminished 7, and it's a C diminished chord, D. Now we move up a half step and we think C sharp diminished 7. So we play a C sharp diminished chord. And then we play a D sharp diminished chord. And you see, it sounds so much different when we do this as well. And that's part of it too. I want you to hear these chords next to each other because it'll just make a big difference on how you can play over this stuff. If you can hear both the horizontal, the scale-based stuff, and the vertical, the chord-based stuff, all right? So here is the entire exercise that I have written out for you, which is running through all 12 diminished seventh chords and playing both of those shapes that make up that diminished scale. So instead of playing the scale, I'm going to basically play a pair of arpeggiated shapes, a pair of chord shapes. So here's what that sounds like. Okay, great. So you could work on that. You could look at the sheet to begin with, but eventually I'd try to get your eyes off of the sheet. Maybe just write down the diminished seventh chord symbols and make sure that you can see the chord symbol and play the two chords that are associated with that chord symbol. Okay. So we're still in theory mode, right? We're still just learning all of these different approaches, all these different ways to think about diminished seventh chords. And that's okay for now. There's a lot of deep, deep theory that goes along with diminished chords. And I think it's really, really important that we understand that theory because I find a lot when I teach my students or my students see like diminished stuff in a scale and they try to analyze it. The theory is where they get a little bit confused, right? And there's a lot of it behind these types of sounds. So I want to do this for a little while so that you have a rock solid understanding of how this theory works. And then we can go on to application. Makes sense to learn where that stuff comes from. And then you can analyze it, hear it better, all that good stuff. So let me know if you have any questions. And remember to get your hands on the PDF by going to 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners, or going to patreon.com, searching for 10 Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. You get that PDF and you get also an audio example of myself playing it for you to play along with, whatever you want to do. All right. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next week with another episode. Hope you all have a great weekend and you're doing well out there. Talk to you soon. Bye.